Yes, indeed, once again, we arrive at the last Sunday of 2021. I pray that you had a good Christmas holiday, that the opportunity to celebrate the birth of Christ was filled with God exalting and Christ glorifying considerations and meditations in your heart. I pray that the Lord gave you a wonderful time to do that, no matter what it is that you celebrated or how you celebrated it. But we come to this last Sunday now of the year, week 52 of calendar year 2021. And like Alan said, what happened to this year? It seems like only yesterday we were celebrating Christmas, and I would really say what really happened in the last 2 years, what 2020 and 21, where did it go? What happened to it? It's interesting on last weeks of things to consider the idea of something being the last of something as we come to the last Sunday of the year. And as I was thinking about that concept of last, a question came to my mind. And it comes out of the text we're working with today, but it's this question. If you knew that today was going to be your last day on this planet, what would you want to say to those closest to you? What would be the last thing you would want to communicate to them? What message would you want to leave them as you were leaving them behind? I mean, if you knew absolutely that this was it and it was time to go, what message would you want them to remember? What words from your lips would you want to have conveyed to you? It's always been fascinating to me that in the movies and in TV shows, when you see somebody dying at the very end, you know, they're laying there gasping out their last breaths and they're going to die. There's rarely anything from their lips that's of any significance or eternality. It was Joe that shot me. Ah. Okay, so it's like, right, so what, right? That's kind of how it's portrayed. I can't help but imagine whenever I see such a thing, I'm thinking, wait a minute, wouldn't there something be much more important on your mind at that very moment? Like, what is beyond and where am I, what's going to happen to my eternal soul here? We come, or we have been, and we continue, I should say, through the epilogue of the book of Joshua. We left off that epilogue a couple of Sundays ago in chapter 22 of Joshua. The last 3 chapters of this book, then, representing what I called an epilogue to the book. The last bits of this book completing both the conquest narrative of the book as well as the allocation section of the book. Now, as the finality of Joshua's life is coming to play. In chapter 22, we saw the conquest completed where Joshua dismissed the Transjordan tribes, the eastern tribes, to go back home. And now we come to chapters 23 and 24, which completes the life of Joshua as he comes to the people. He gives them a charge. He makes a covenant renewal with them, and then his obituary included at the end. Now, let me repeat something that I did say a couple of weeks ago because it'll be relevant here. I am convinced that these last 3 chapters, 22 through 24, were written by somebody else. They weren't written by Joshua. Okay, we know that the very last paragraphs of the book couldn't possibly be written by Joshua because it includes his obituary. Obviously, somebody else had to write that. But there are a couple of other bits of evidence that suggest that this last 3 chapters was tacked on to the end of Joshua's work by a loyal friend, somebody who came after him. Joshua's missing from the narrative of chapter 22, verses 10 to 34, all that discussion about the altar that they built, remember, as they were going back home. The eastern tribes built as they were going back. Joshua's not included anywhere in that text. And if you look at the summary at the end of chapter 21, verses 43 to 45, that makes an excellent ending to the part written by Joshua. It's like his last words to say, this is what I did over the course of my life, and so therefore, here it is. Here's the book, and somebody else adds to it after that. So it seems as though this last part is written by someone else. And I find another evidence of that at the beginning of chapter 23. Beginning of chapter 23, Joshua 23, it says, a long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all the surrounding enemies, and Joshua was old and well advanced in years. Now, notice that phrase, a long time afterward, okay? A long time afterward. At the beginning of chapter 22, one chapter earlier, it starts with, at that time Joshua summoned, okay? The events then of the Transjordan tribes going back home is an immediate event that occurs at that time. After the allocation of the land in chapters 14 to 21, then Joshua says to the eastern tribes, okay, you can go home now. You've done your part, you kept your promise, go back home. The initial conquest is now complete. However, chapter 23 starts with a different phrase. It says, a long time afterward. So it implies that there is a gap of time between chapters 22 and 23. A long time after the events of chapter 22. Now, I'm convinced, we can have an argument if you want to about this, but you'll lose. But I mean, we can have an argument. I am assuming that Joshua was probably about the same age as Caleb was when the two men were sent as spies into southern Canaan when the people of Israel arrived there. I'm convinced of that, okay? I can't imagine Joshua being significantly younger or older than Caleb and being included in the spies. Let's put it like this. What kind of men would Moses have chosen to be the 12 spies to go into the land? Well, he wouldn't want too young of men because they would not have not had the maturity to look and see what this was about and what they were supposed to do. And then they couldn't be too old either because they might be inclined to a different view of that land. And so Moses probably picked out what I would call middle-aged men. Remember, Caleb was 40 when Moses sent him in. Remember, he himself says that. I was 40 years old when I went in. So I'm going to guess, and I think this is probably a fair speculation, that Joshua was probably about 40 years old at the same time when he was sent in with Caleb, okay? He could have been a little younger or a little older, but not significantly to our speculations. So that would imply that Joshua would be about 85 when the allocation of the land that takes place in those chapters, chapters 14 and beyond, took place. That Joshua was probably about 85 at that particular point in time. Now, again, that's some sanctified speculation because we don't have any record of Joshua's age at the time. The only record we have of his age is when he dies. We are told then in chapter 24, verse 29, that he lives to be 110. So he lives to be 110 years old. So if my assumptions are correct, that Joshua was about 85 when the allocation took place, he dies at 110, then that difference in time is about 25 years. There's about 25 years of time then probably between chapters 22 and 23. In other words, the conquest, that 5 to 7 year period of time occurs roughly when Joshua was roughly about 80 to 85 years old. And then after that, he does the allocation of the land. That doesn't take very long, of course. And then a long time afterward, then we have this chapter coming. That's probably what that means. 25 years of time has elapsed between the last time that Joshua did anything with the people in terms of allocating the land and now this last bit of thing before he dies, about 25 years. I believe that Joshua spent that 25 years rebuilding the city of Timnath-Serah allotted to him in chapter 19, verses 49 and 50. It says he rebuilt the city. So he went to that place, he brought his family there, and over that last period of his life, he spent rebuilding that city. And the people there, his family went with him. We're also told in the book of Judges, chapter 2, verse 7, that the people remained faithful in their initial places during his lifetime. We'll see that also at the end of this book. That we're told that as Joshua finishes the work of the conquest, handing the inheritance to the people, allocating it to him. He then goes home, and for this period of time in between, the people of Israel remain faithful to the Lord. They continue in their ways. They worship and they serve the Lord in this place. And it says that they were faithful during this time. Now, I'm also convinced that Joshua was graced with the same strength, physical strength, that Caleb had received from the Lord. Remember back in chapter 14 when Caleb was given his allotment, he comes to Joshua and he says, Moses promised me some land because I was faithful and I have the same strength I had, even though I'm 85 years old, but I have the same strength I had in those days. Why did Caleb have that strength? Because he had been faithful to the Lord and going into the land and spying it out, and when he came back and gave a good report, as Joshua did, God said, that man is going to live long and prosper. And I'm convinced that that's exactly what happened to Joshua as well. He lives to 110 years old. His sight is not diminished. His strength is not diminished. That last 25 years of his life, he may be 85, but he's not 85 as we think of 85. He has strength. He has an ability to lead still. He still has a vigor of spirit. I'm convinced of that. So it seems to me then that this long time afterward tells me that this was written by someone else. Joshua has finished his work, conquest, allocation, sending the tribes home, and then he says, my time is done. That's the end of chapter 21. Somebody else then later comes along and adds this epitaph to the end of the book to honor Joshua, someone who was loyal to him, someone who knew him and knew this, had been a part of this and added this to the text, in my opinion. So, what we're going to do then is we're going to look at chapters 23 and 24 now, this event that takes place at the end of Joshua's life, way to the end of Joshua's life as he's about to die. And we're going to do so as one sermon in two parts. We'll start this morning, and Lord willing, we'll be back to look at the second half of it next week. We learned then in the beginning of chapter 23, as I just read a moment ago, that Joshua is old and well advanced in years. We already know that he was 110 when he died, so he is very close to that age at this point. And it says he's about to go the way of all the earth, which is a euphemism for he's about to die. Because we all go the way of the earth, right? We all follow in the footsteps of men and women who have gone before us. They all died. We're going to go with them. It is time then for him to leave a final word to Israel as they, those who survive him, embark on their next chapter without him. He has been faithful to lead them these years. After taking up the mantle of leadership from Moses, now he's going to pass along to them the responsibility to carry on. Now you will notice there's no specific leader being appointed here. Joshua's not going to hand the reins to somebody else below him, as Moses did. Moses gave to Joshua the leadership, but that's not what takes place here. Because what begins here is the theocracy of Israel, where Israel will be led now directly by God through the priests at the tabernacle and under the leadership of the tribal leaders themselves. So this will be a loose confederacy of tribes under the direct leadership of God through the priests at the tabernacle. We call that the theocracy. It will be another 200 years or so before they ask for a king when Saul is appointed. So the period of the judges begins at this point. Just as this book started with Joshua giving instructions to Israel about entering into the promised land, now he gives them a final set of exhortations as they begin their new life in the promised land. I have brought you into this land. I exhorted you. I gave you instructions. We crossed the river. We took on Jericho and Ai and all kinds of other places. I allocated land to you. You have gone and spread out into those places and have begun to live there. And so now I'm leaving you. Just as I gave you a set of instructions at the beginning, I'm giving you a set of instructions at the end. Now, who is it that Joshua is speaking to? It's the audience of this soliloquy that he's about to give, starting in the middle of verse 2. It says at the beginning of verse 2 that Joshua summoned all Israel, its elders and heads, its judges and officers, and said to them. I find it interesting that the ESV entitles this chapter Joshua's Charge to Israel's Leaders. However, if you look closely at verse 2 and compare it to chapter 24, verse 1, you will see that the audience is exactly the same. It's identical. Joshua summons all Israel in chapter 23, verse 2, and all the tribes of Israel in 24:1. What's the difference? I don't think there is one. Along with its leadership. So the elders come, the tribal heads come, the judges come, the military officers come, everyone who has a leadership position comes, but it's also including the people themselves. There's no reason to believe that Joshua's charge in chapter 23 then is limited to just its leaders. I think the title in the ESV is wrong. It seems more likely to me that Joshua speaks through the leadership, in both cases, to the people as a whole. He wants to make a communication to all of Israel, not just to its leaders, but to all of its people. And of course, he would gather the leaders closest to himself, but the people would be there as well as a part of the discussion. The covenant renewal of chapter 24 then is preceded by a great charge to the people as a whole in chapter 23. So the charge in 23 leads naturally to the covenant renewal in 24, is how I would view this. So as I said before, I think the two chapters belong together, a charge to faithfulness and then a covenant renewal of it. All right, now go down to verse 3. And you have seen, and speaking to the people now, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake, for it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. All right. Joshua is going to give here a quick summary of what has already taken place during his leadership. It is the Lord your God who has done these things. Verse 4. Behold, I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I've already cut off from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. Okay, so that's just a simple, brief summary of what Joshua has already done. It is the Lord who has done the things that they have seen to the nations in Canaan. Thus the land has been allotted as an inheritance to them, although the nations still remain. As we've talked about many times, the nations around the Israelites in Canaan are not completely driven out. It was never the intention of God for them to be driven out. He has driven them back such that they no longer can control and operate the land. The Israelites have somewhat of a control over it, but it's intended for the Israelites to continue to drive them out. He has given the Israelites the land and will continue to fight for them in finishing the job. Okay, that's the message that he's trying to send. It is the Lord your God who has fought for you, verse 3, and will continue to do so, verse 5. Just as the Lord came with us as we crossed the Jordan, came into Canaan, and fought for us at Jericho and Ai and 1,000 other places, he is going to continue to do that into the future. There's no reason to not trust the Lord in the future just because I'm not around, Joshua says. So that's what he does. He gives a quick summary of what has already taken place, and then he gives them, in verses 6 to 8, a charge to keep the law of Moses in relationship, firstly, to the Canaanite gods. Listen to what it says. Therefore, okay, here's the conclusion. Here's what you need to do. Therefore, be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them, but you shall cling to the Lord, you shall cling to Yahweh, your God, just as you have done to this day. It's a specific charge that begins Joshua's charge that they are to keep specifically the first and second commandments. It is a charge specific to the first and second commandments. You find those written, of course, in Exodus 20, verses 3 and 4, Deuteronomy 5, 7, and 8. Specifically, do not take any of the gods of the Canaanites before, or the word could be beside, Yahweh. Let me put it like this. Never mistake a fictional deity for the one true and living God. All right? Never mistake a fictional deity for the true and living God. Or we might say it like this, as in, remember what the true God has shown you through his power. The true God has shown you some things, hasn't he? He was reading from Numbers this morning. There's a little recap of some of the things. Moses adds a recap in that chapter to where the people had been. They had come from Egypt. They come to the wilderness. They come to the Red Sea. They cross the Red Sea. They come into the wilderness. They get to place after place after place after place. Why? Because God led them to each of those places. Because God gave them protection and safety and provision in each of those places. That was the point of the chapter. Remember what God has shown you. The ability to overthrow the locals, even as a group of untrained former slaves, can only be accounted for the power of Yahweh. His power unleashed demonstrates his reality. Joshua is saying to them, listen, no fictional deity of the Canaanites could ever do what Yahweh has done. You can stand before the fictional deities of Canaan all day long and ask for them to part the sea, and it will never happen. You can ask for him to overthrow a city like Jericho by making its walls fall down. It will never happen. Do not mistake a fictional deity for the power of the one true God. But secondly, to go with it, the second commandment then, do not take any of the graven images and imagine them as a source of divine power. Not only should you not take and have any connection to the fictional deities of the Canaanites, but you should also not take any of the objects that they create as manifestations of those deities. Never mistake an image of a deity for Yahweh, whose existence is beyond the scope of what can be formed by man. You cannot create anything out of metal or wood that would in some way represent a God infinitely greater than this universe that we live in. By the way, just as an aside, a replacement telescope for Hubble went into space yesterday. And it will have 10 times the peering power that Hubble has. So it should be very interesting in about a year or two what we start getting back from that. But what it's going to show us is that this universe is beyond our comprehension. And God is infinitely greater than that. So don't try to carve an image of Yahweh out of a stick and think that somehow that represents him. It does not. Do not create a cheap substitute for what has been revealed. The power to overthrow the natives cannot be bottled in a wooden or metallic image. No image of the Canaanites could do what they have seen. You see, the primary temptation of the Israelites from the remaining Canaanites will be to draw them into their false religions, to lure Israel to mix with them at the religious level and be compromised. The very first temptation that's going to come to these Israelites as they wander into Canaan now and begin to settle in that place is to be lured to mix with the natives at the religious level and be compromised. A great temptation for a follower of Christ is to mix into the thinking of this world. Sometimes we have a very hard time telling the difference, don't we? A great temptation for us will be to embrace the thinking patterns of this world around us. But that's a violation of the first and second commandments. To be drawn into the idols of wealth or power or comfort or ease, or I could add another list of words 1.5 miles long here. To be drawn into these kinds of things and to have our first love compromised, seduced into being just like everyone else. How easy that is. Well, I don't want to be different because I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want people to point at me and look at me and see me as different because, as much as we all talk about wanting to be different from everybody else, our culture is bent on making everybody exactly the same. Right? We wear all the same clothes. We use all the same iPhone. We all have the same ringtone. It sounds exactly the same. When your iPhone rings, everybody looks around. Is that me? Did my phone go off? When the text message comes, was that me? Because we're all exactly the same. The embracing of this conformity in this world is what we're lured to and drawn to. We don't want to stand out. But the follower of Christ, by definition, stands out. Because he or she says, I will not be compromised by the thinking of this world, and I will stand for what is revealed as truth. And I will not make an idol out of the things around me. I will worship and serve the one true God and his Son, Jesus Christ, alone. See, the devil doesn't need you to apostatize your faith. He doesn't need you to do that. In fact, he'd prefer you didn't. He only needs to steer you slightly away from Jesus as your primary focus in order to make you useless to the cause of Christ in the world. He would prefer that you stay a Christian and become compromised, embrace worldly thinking, because then he can use you as an example of someone who brings a bad name upon the church. You see, look at him. He doesn't need us to apostatize. He just needs us to mix a little bit with the world and stir a little bit of the world's thinking into our way of thinking so that he can destroy the faith little by little. Or so he thinks he can. The Israelites mixing a little Canaanite idol worship into their lives will cause them to fail in the task of completing what God had begun in them. And us mixing a little worldly focus into our lives will cause us to fail in the task of completing what God has begun in us. Because what God has begun in us is to conform us fully and completely to the image of Christ. And a little worldly thinking isn't going to take you in that direction. A charge first by Joshua to keep the law of Moses in relation to the Canaanite gods. But he has a second charge that follows after it, starting in verse 9, when he says, For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to fight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God. For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you, and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you. Sounded like something you read this morning. It's a charge, in this case, to faithfulness in not marrying into the Canaanite peoples. It's a charge that's not directly but incidentally connected to the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. But in this case, it's not to commit spiritual adultery. The Israelites are to treat the covenant relationship they have with God similar to the lifelong covenantal relationship to God that God commands you to maintain with your spouse. The relationship that God has with his people is pictured by God himself, and it's much more prominent in the New Testament than the Old, but it's still here. A marriage relationship, a lifelong monogamous covenantal relationship, where both parties remain faithful until death. In this case, then, it's as in do not make marriages with the natives, thus compromising the fundamental spiritual nature of the family, dragging such mixed households away from true Yahweh worship. Now you'll notice that the seventh commandment is built on the fundamental nature of God himself. All of them are. But the seventh is just as much like the rest, built upon the very nature of God himself. It is one of absolute covenant commitment. Yahweh cannot commit adultery in abandoning his covenant relationships. He will never abandon those to whom he's been connected covenantally. When God says, you are my people, I am your God, that is a commitment by God, far stronger than any I do that two people say in front of a pastor or a priest at an altar. The reality is that it is a covenant relationship that God has made with his people. And he says, I'm going to remain faithful to you. You must remain faithful to me. Do not be dragged away and out of this relationship. So a secondary temptation, the first one being to embrace the gods of the Canaanites, a second temptation that will come to the Israelites then, is from the remaining Canaanites, will be to draw the Israelites into marital relationships, to lure the Israelites to mix with them at the family level and be diluted as a nation. What happens when Israelites marry non-Israelites and have babies? Are those babies Israelites? Well, they're half Israelites. And then when those half Israelites marry some more Canaanites, what happens to the bloodline? It is diluted. The household that is mixed between a follower of Christ and an unbelieving spouse will have the natural tendency to pull the believer away from a full-orbed life of sanctification and worship. It rarely goes the other way. In fact, I've never seen it go the other way. I have seen well-meaning believers marry unbelievers thinking that they can redeem them. And sometime later we find that the believer in that household has been drawn away from true faith. Now, here's something interesting. The Apostle Paul never actually prohibits a believer from marrying an unbeliever. There's no actual command in the New Testament that Paul actually says, thou shalt not marry an unbeliever. However, Paul's principles are such in his teachings that would strongly suggest that he believes such would be deeply unwise. Deeply unwise. In 1 Timothy 2, he speaks of the family, of course, as the bedrock of civilization. The very foundation of what it means to be human is based on the marriage relationship that started in the garden when Eve was formed and given to Adam and a family was born, and it's from that family that the command of God, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and take dominion over it, begins. So Paul understood that principally. He also believed that Christian marriage is a picture of Christ and his church. Ephesians chapter 5. It's the image of a church submitting to Christ and Christ ruling over his church in a loving, self-sacrificial relationship. The picture of Christ and his church is painted in a Christian marriage. And Paul also believed that there are dangers in long-term commitments with unbelievers. 2 Corinthians 6:14. Passage often quoted to say, well, see, he says don't marry somebody. And that's not what it's saying. It's saying long-term connections between believers and unbelievers are unwise. It would be just as much for him to say don't make a contract with an unbeliever because you can get yourself into trouble in that kind of relationship. So Paul's principles, even though he doesn't specifically prohibit a believer marrying an unbeliever, is, to me, seems clear and obvious that Paul would probably nod his head at this point and say, yeah, that's right. I never specifically prohibited, but it would be horribly unwise to do so. Why? Because it goes all the way back to the days of Israel, when God said, do not intermarry with foreigners. Because when you do, those foreigners, those foreign wives, are going to become, as Joshua says, They're going to become snares and traps and whips and thorns in your eyeballs. Delightful imagery, isn't it? That's what's going to happen. If you marry somebody, if you intermarry with a pagan, let's put it that way, you marry a pagan as a follower of Yahweh, that pagan wife is going to drag you away. Look, I don't have to go too far into the New Testament to show you into the Old Testament to show you an excellent example of that. When the wisest man in the world, supposedly, married 700 women and 300 concubines, and it says that later in his life those wives dragged him away from Yahweh. He had made all kinds of political alliances through the women that he married, and they dragged him away from the worship of Yahweh. And it was his son, Rehoboam, the idiot, that split the kingdom of Israel because of it. Because of Solomon's wives. For those of you who are single in the room and looking for someone to marry, let me give you this advice. Never date anyone who does not prioritize Christ above all things, including you. But there is a promise in Joshua's charge, starting in verse 14 to 16. Joshua gives this charge. Don't take on the gods of the Canaanites. Don't embrace them. And don't intermarry with the Canaanites either. But now in verses 14 to 16, he gives a promise, and it's a two-sided promise. Now I'm about to go the way of all the earth, and you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. But just as all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you have been fulfilled for you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the evil things, until he has destroyed you from off this good land that the Lord your God has given you, if you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God which he commanded you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land that he has given you. Now, as I said, it's a two-sided promise. The one side is positive, the other side is negative. God has kept, the positive side, verse 14, God has kept all of his promises to you and will continue to do so. God has kept all of his promises to you and will continue to do so. Now, let me notice, I don't know what translation you're using, but if you look closely at verse 14, Joshua quotes this. He says that not one word has failed of all the good things that the Lord your God promised you. Okay, if you have a pencil, cross out that word things, if you're using an ESV, and write in the word words. Because it's not things, it's words, okay? Not one word has failed of all the good words that the Lord your God promised concerning you. This isn't about things. This is about promises. This is about oral promises that God has made. I have promised you this, I have promised you this, I have promised you this. All of my words are true. Same thing twice in verse 15. Same thing twice in verse 15. Everything God said he was going to do, he did. And you know it to be true in your heart. That's what he's saying. You know this to be true. You've walked around and you've seen what Yahweh has done. Come on. Be reasonable. Open your eyes and reflect upon what Yahweh has accomplished. What has he done? He has done everything he said he was going to do, and you know it to be true. The obvious point the obvious part of the promise that Joshua was making here is, what you have seen him do already, he will continue to do. There's no reason to believe that God is going to stop doing what he has done. No, he is in a covenant relationship with you. Just as he wants you to be faithful to him by not committing spiritual adultery, so he will be faithful to you in what he has done and what he will continue to do. He'll continue to be faithful to you. That's the positive side of this promise. It's a simple promise. It's a simple promise, but it's amazingly profound. But there is a negative side in verse 15. While God has kept all of his promises to you and will continue to do so, God will destroy you if you transgress your promises. If you transgress the covenant, then God will bring all the evil words upon you. Okay, now see that word things? Cross out that word things, replace it with the word words. God will bring all of what he has said he will do to the evildoers, to you. One way to translate that could be, everything he said he was going to do to the Canaanites, he's going to turn around and do to you, if you transgress his covenant. Everything that God warned he would do, he will do, and you know it. Again, your fathers told you about the incident with the calf at Sinai. They all died now. They're all dead. And many of them died at the calf event. But guess what? They told you. Moses comes down from the mountain. He finds this golden calf that Aaron says popped out of the fire, some magically. And God killed thousands for having done that. You've seen that. Or you may not have seen it, but you've heard it. Joshua saw it. This is what God is going to do. Fail God, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land. Now let me put before you, you probably have heard me say this many times before, but it's one of those things, as a preacher of the word, I need to hammer into your head, okay? The Word of God is simple and one-sided, okay? The Word of God is simple and one-sided. Everybody wants to make what God has said more complicated than it really is, right? Everybody wants to make it much more complex than it really is. No, it's really very simple. God's Word is simple. Obey Him and be blessed. Disobey Him and be cursed. That's it. The whole Scripture could be summed up that way, really. Now, how do I know that? Well, I know it because Adam heard it at the beginning of time. The very first thing that God said to Adam was, well, give or take, was, eat from the tree and you shall die. Don't eat from the tree and you'll live. It's that simple. That was how simple it was for Adam. Eat and die, don't eat and live. Got it? Any questions? Notice how much more difficult we want to make it. Well, let's see. There's probably gradations of that. If I just nibble, is that going to bring death too? And what if I just touch it, and take it and feel of it and look at it, No, it's not. No, it's simple. God says, obey me and live. Disobey me and die. Be blessed or be cursed. Your blessings come from obedience. Your curses come from disobedience. The whole world is cursed because of disobedience. It's that simple. I know. We like to make it more complicated than it is, but we don't need to. The entirety of a relationship with God is built on this single promise. You understand that? The entirety of a relationship with Yahweh is built on this simple thing. Obey me and live, disobey me and die. That's it. That's our relationship with Yahweh. It's a relationship of all mankind, all of this world, to the one who created it. It's that simple. Now, I realize there's a whole lot of people who don't believe that, of course. They're basically walking around and saying, I could disobey the law. I don't even need to know it, and live my life. God will still love me in some ridiculous and preposterous sort of way. I'm not exactly sure how they do the math, but nonetheless, that's what is believed. But that's not the case. The Bible cannot be more clear from Genesis 1 to the end of Revelation. Obey me and live. Disobey me and die. All men have a relationship with God that's based on this and nothing else. Contrary to the secularized Christianity of our day, God did not create the world for our happiness. He did not create the world for our religiosity. He didn't create the world for our financial status or our sense of what constitutes justice. Nope. God created us to serve Him in obedience to His revealed law, not in rebellion of any kind against it. Period, end of sentence. It's that simple. The world needs to understand this. We need to be teaching our children this. Obey God and live, disobey God and die. Now, obviously, as you sit there and think, well, what does this have to do with Jesus? How does this fit with Jesus? Well, the answer to that is simple. Since none of us can obey God and live, we need one who can obey God so that we can live, because we need a vicarious obedience. We need obedience from someone else who was actually able to be obedient even though we cannot be obedient. We needed one who came and lived a perfect, sinless life. When we talk about the incarnation of the Christ, we're talking about the Son of God entering into this world in order to do what you and I have never been able to do, which is to keep every jot and tittle of the law he had established in this world, to do precisely what God demands from his creatures. So that we can turn to him and say to Yahweh, so we could say to the Father, I can't be obedient, but he was obedient for me. Will you accept his obedience on my behalf? Will you take what he did in my place? And the Father says, well, that's why I sent him, of course. Yes. Embrace the Son. Kiss the Son, lest the Father be angry at you. Why? Because you're a disobedient one. Because we're all disobedient. But Christ has entered into this world to bring this Word of God, this promise of God, into the world. When we talk about the Logos coming into the world, we're talking about one who came and said, look, I am the embodiment of that promise. I am the incarnation of the promise. Obey God and live, rebel and disobey and die. I am the embodiment of that. I am literally standing before you as the promise of God. When you look at me, you see that. And so I'm going to keep that law, and this is Jesus speaking, I'm going to keep that law, I'm going to keep that law perfectly, and I'm going to die as a substitute for those who could not do so, to satisfy the Father's wrath over them. They will then come to me, and I will say to them, I give you my obedience. I give you my righteousness. The Christmas season is an opportunity for us to think about the fact that God understood that the moment that Adam ate from that tree, every human being after that, from that point on, would never be able to be obedient and would be cursed. And so he sent his Son into the world to be that obedience for us. Joshua says to his friends, look, says to Israel, look, yeah, his friends, it's simple, my friends. You're about to go and live in a land, you're now living in land, not about to. You're living in a land full of Canaanites, a bunch of pagans all around you. They're going to try to drag you off into their deities. And they're going to try to drag you off into their graven images. And they're going to try to drag you off into marital relationships and other kinds of relationships. Don't go there. Because if you do, you will destroy the relationship that you have with God. Don't do it. Don't do it. And we have another 1,000 years of Israelite history from this point that reminds us very clearly that what Joshua said to his people was spot on. Oh, they took on the images of the Canaanites. They embraced the deities of the pagans. They married into the peoples. And they were destroyed. They were destroyed. So, if this was your last day in the world, and you could say something to your children or to your spouse or to your friends or to close family, what is the last thing you would want to tell them before you go? We should want to tell them, trust God and live, and find your righteousness in Christ and nowhere else. The essence of the gospel message is remain faithful to the Lord. Do not stray away. The message to us is be faithful to the Lord in the one who was faithful. Be loyal to him and obedient to him, and he will mediate for you in his obedience before the Father. This should be our very clear message to the whole world, not only on this last Sunday of a year, but as we start a new one.